Good evening. I'm Roger Kimball. I would love to have this be an event that your grandchildren will cluster around and say, "Mommy and Daddy, tell us about the time that you were at a New York event and it started almost on time." My ambition was to start early, but I guess this counts as a little early. I'm Roger Kimball, the publisher of Encounter Books, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of Encounter and the Manhattan Institute to this roundtable discussion. I'm so glad you could come. It's a deep question that we're pondering today. Will America forge a new political consensus? And to conjure with this question, we have five very eminent individuals. Mr. Peter Thiel, the entrepreneur and author. Mr. William Kristol, the founding editor of the Weekly Standard and well-known pundit. Matt Drudge, oh no, it's not Matt Drudge, that's Frank Buckley, the author of the book The Way Back. Rich Lowry, the editor of National Review, and James Piereson, the author of Shattered Consensus. Now, these two books, Shattered Consensus and The Way Back, were really the origin of this roundtable discussion. We thought it would be nice because they both, although written before some recent fermentation in our political culture, actually reflect on what has been happening in our culture. And so we thought we'd have a roundtable discussion, and then we thought, well, let's make it a little bigger and include some other people. And so I'm delighted that we have this cast of characters. You'll find, I think, that there are some differences of opinion, but I think there is also considerable unanimity about the problems that face us. And I know that you will leave here wanting to reflect more about these issues. So we have considerately made Mr. Piereson's book, Mr. Buckley's book, and Mr. Thiel's book available for very modest consideration outside this door. And I hope you will avail yourself of that wisdom in the waiting. Now, unfortunately, we have very little time tonight, so I'm going to get right to it. I'm going to ask each of our participants a question, and then I hope we'll have some conversation among them. And then I hope, I can't promise, but I hope we'll have time for at least a couple of questions. I doubt that there will be time for more than that. Peter, I'd like to start with you. In your book, 0 to 1, for sale just outside this door, you make the interesting point about novelty in business. It's one thing, you say, to copy a product that's already been done and enhance it, make it better, to move essentially from one to some exponential n after one. It's quite another thing, you say, to go from 0 to 1, to be disruptive and actually create something new that changes the way we think, and indeed the way we live. Now, during the last presidential campaign, you said several things that made me think that one of the things that attracted you by Donald Trump was the potential for this kind of disruption. And I wonder if you'd like to say a word or two about the sorts of disruptions you saw, whether you think that they are likely to be beneficent, and any problems you see in the road ahead.
Well, let me actually start with a small quibble with that question. I'm always very uncomfortable with the word disruption. I think it's one of the most overused buzzwords in our society. If you're starting a business, you're not, even though if you're a big incumbent, you're worried about disruption, and you're worried about small businesses that disrupt you. If you're starting a new business, or if you're an innovator in politics or anywhere else, your goal is not to disrupt other people, or to destroy other people's businesses, but it's to try to be successful. Disruptive people tend to be people who want to get attention, and they find it, but often in sort of a bad way. So it's sort of like the disruptive person in first grade gets sent to the principal's office.
I remember that.
One of my colleagues started Napster, which was a business that set out to disrupt the music industry. And you nap a child, you nap some music.
Right.
It sounds kind of, you got on the cover of Time magazine, and a year later, the government comes after you. So, I just,
By the way,
I'll start with that.
I think we should congratulate Roger for the first time ever actually using a trendy buzz phrase.
Well,
I did it for you,
hopefully
Rich.
it'll be the last time.
I've been reading the new Criterion for years, looking for a trendy buzz phrase.
So anyway, I'm just trying to give you some negative reinforcement there, so that we won't start a trend with using trendy buzzwords. But I think that I think there are ways in which Trump represents certain discontinuity, and also and certain ways in which it's a certain kind of continuity. And let me I think people have focused a lot on the ways in which it's discontinuous. Let me say something about where it's continuous, and in a way that I think is somewhat important. And it is a certain kind of pessimistic realism about our society and our country. And that is actually sort of a point where I think Trump is strangely very continuous with Obama, who was, I would say, the most pessimistic of the three main candidates in 2008. You say McCain, Hillary Clinton, and Obama. And Obama's pessimism sort of came to the fore in an April 2009 interview where people asked him whether he thought America was an exceptional country. And Obama lied. Yes, it's exceptional, just like Britain thinks Britain's exceptional, and the Greeks think Greece is exceptional. And now I would submit that the word exceptional is a superset of the word great. You can have one exceptional country, you can have a few great countries. And so when Trump had the slogan, "Make America Great Again," that was even more pessimistic. If Obama was lying about the U.S., what he really meant it was not exceptional anymore. Trump much more directly was saying that we were not even great. So it's like Obama said, "Yeah, you're an A+ student. Everybody's getting an A+." Mm-hmm. And then Trump said, "Maybe you could get an A again sometime in the future." And I think this sort of pessimistic realism is what makes Trump very unpopular in the bubbles that are New York City or Washington or Silicon Valley or Hollywood, where people like to tell these and I'll just pick on Silicon Valley since that's where I'm from, where people like to tell these sort of fantastic utopian stories about how great they are, these sort of how many great things they're doing for our society and our country. And if someone comes along and says, maybe if you work harder you can get an A, that's at least very discordant. And so and I think that's sort of the, and then where you go with that is unclear. And in the various speeches I gave on behalf of Trump this last year, the criticism was always, well, so what if you say this, what are you going to do about it? And where do you go from there? I think there are a lot of challenges, and we can discuss how much you can do about these things. But I think even that as a starting point was more than we got from the sort of zombie-like people who were giving us some sort of Orwellian newspeak, where it was all these canned lines. And
anybody in mind?
No, all of them. Just about all of them. Mm-hmm. Maybe Sanders felt strangely authentic. It was sort of crazy and very misguided and wrong.
Right.
But all the others sounded shockingly fake.
Great. Bill, throughout the election season, you were one of the most thoughtful critics, I think, of Donald Trump, especially on the issue of foreign policy. Now that Trump has become president and has more or less assembled his defense team and his national security team, I wonder, has anything, I know it's early days yet, anything that he's done or promised to do that has led you to reconsider some of those criticisms, or have any surprises?
Not really, but so that's a short answer. So you want to ask Frank something?
Confess.
I mean, look, he said, no, well, confess. I mean, he found a very good national security advisor after firing his first one after 24 days. It was not a very good national security advisor. I'm very happy with General Mattis and General McMaster, and I think the jury's out on Rex Tillerson, who we don't know much about what his foreign policy views are or how he intends to manage the State Department. But no, I feel much better with McMaster and Mattis there. I don't have great confidence in Trump as commander-in-chief, and I do think the president matters, though we could have my view is we could have a better Trump, I wrote this the week after the election, we could have a better Trump administration than we have a Trump as president, because I think parts of the administration are run by pretty impressive people. They will default to fairly normal Republican policies, which from my point of view is better than most Trump policies, since I actually am not, despite Peter's characterization, there's a certain zombiness, I agree, and fakeness to the defenders of the old order. But the old order also is the liberal world order, which the United States has been central to for 70 years, and which has on the whole been a good thing. And liberal democracy at home, which is on the whole a good and impressive thing, despite some problems with the administrative state and other judicial activism and other aspects of progressivism. Still, I don't know that I would not throw out the baby with the bathwater, and I think that both those babies, the international liberal order and the domestic liberal democracy, are worth preserving. So I'm happy to the degree that the Trump administration resembles a Rubio or Walker or Bush administration, honestly. I think it will to some degree, but the chaos sort of from the top down on Trump's part worries me. And I would say the one thing that I'm disappointed by, just to be a little provocative maybe here, this is probably the most pro-Trump crowd ever assembled at the Harvard Club of New York or any Harvard Club anywhere in the world, I'm going to just say, you know. I'm just guessing. I don't know what people's views are, but I don't think he has yet, maybe this will change, it's only a month in, internalized the fact that he's president of the United States. You know, I'm serious. He is not he is behaving just the way he did in the campaign, which was just the way he behaved before then. And there's some entertaining aspects to that and some impressive aspects, I suppose one could say. But at the end of the day, I don't know that he really appreciates the way I would like him to appreciate the fact that he's president of the United States. And I think you see that in many things he's said. Most recently, his comment about Putin's a killer, but we've done a lot of killing too. I mean, for a president of the United States to say that is disturbing to me. People might want to say, oh, it's just a tweet or it's just a comment, but it's something no other president has said in an awful long time, and I'm sort of happy to have had presidents who didn't believe that until Donald Trump.
Frank.
Well, you heard it here. We're all Trump supporters now, aren't we?
Frank, during the campaign, you wrote that the Trump movement was an effort to distinguish between what was living and what was dead in conservatism.
Don't take it personally.
I wonder if you'd...
Sometimes what is dead is better than what is living. I believe conservatives used to think that. You know?
I wonder if you'd like to elaborate on that distinction.
I'd be delighted to, and let me start by thanking you, but also to note that in addition to everything else, I'm also a senior editor of the American Spectator, whose Bob Tyrrell is over there, one of the heroes of American conservatism. I don't worry over much about the Trump persona. Pascal said that there is a God-shaped hole in one's heart, but for Americans it seems to be a Reagan-shaped hole or an Obama-shaped hole, whereas I think that mostly politicians are the lowest form of worms that God has ever suffered to walk upon the face of the earth, and therefore I don't worry over much about them, but that comes from somebody with a parliamentary background. No, I think what is dead, and rightly dead, is a certain kind of conservatism which was more a set of rules of geometry than anything that related to that which permits people to flourish and be happy. It was the 59-point plan of Mitt Romney, which absolutely nobody read, whereas what we heard, of course, was the 47% of takers. I think that in my book I argued that the one crucial fact about American politics and about the 2016 election and 2012 was that for the first time Americans no longer thought that their kids would have it as well off as they did. I thought that was absolutely crucial. I thought that we, being a Darwinian, I think that we worry more about our children than even we do about ourselves. And this brought people out to the polls. And what was the Republican response to all of this? Well, the perfect Republican idiot said, firstly, it doesn't exist. And then he said, secondly, if it does exist, it's the fault of the victims, right? The oxy-sniffing proletariat, right? Which gave rise to a whole redneck porn literature, which I find kind of despicable. And then to make things worse, what they omitted to say was, to the extent that there is such a problem as there is, it's a consequence of all of the things that the left has done in giving us terrible K-12 schools, a broken down rule of law, and an immigration system that imports immobility. Cretinism does not descend much lower than any of that. The other great issue in the campaign was corruption, and that was an issue, of course, easily for Trump. I mean, how could it be otherwise with running against Hillary? We had, I think, a kind of Machiavellian moment. Pethokoukis said there was a Machiavellian moment in 1776 where people discovered a desire for Republican virtue as opposed to the corruption of Britain. And I think Americans have had it up to here with corruption, at least as they see it, in Washington, in all of the lobbyists in K Street and so on. Trump has proposed some changes with that respect to all of that. Much more can be done. At this point, K Street or Congress is a farm team for K Street. There are things that we can shut down. So all in all, here I am, you know, somebody who became an American only a couple of years back, and it seems to me that, well, Mill said if you only know your side of the argument, you don't know very much about it. And if you only know about America, you don't know much about America. So I think the proper question for Americans is roughly, why do we suck? Roughly, why is it the case that we are so absolutely mediocre in terms of rankings of economic liberty? Why is it that Kanakistan up in Canada is doing so much better than we are in terms of liberty? Why is it the case that their K-12 system is doing splendidly and ours isn't? Why is it the case that they can be so generous with respect to refugees, where we are so horrible with respect to refugees? Why? Because they have a government they more or less trust, and because they have a very, very conservative immigration system. In general, if you looked at that which Trump wants, he would find it perfectly enacted in the Canadian statute book. So I see Trump as a figure who will turn American conservatism away from the geometry of fixed rules into something that is more responsive to the concerns of ordinary Americans, and that is all a good thing.
Thank you. Say, Rich, you're the author of an important book about how Abraham Lincoln saved the American dream. And you, like Bill, are also a thoughtful critic of Donald Trump, who, in his talk about making America great again, perhaps that does have a pessimistic reading, but it also, I think, has an aspirational sense. This is something that we can aspire to. It seems to me that an argument could be made that that ambition is not so unlike Lincoln's ambition to save the American dream. But especially given the sharp partisan passions that divide the country now, as they divided the country in Lincoln's time, I wonder if there's anything that you have found, early days yet again, anything you found to applaud in Trump's efforts to bring us together, as he's often said he wants to do, and if there are still things you find worrisome in his performance.
Yeah, well, I think those of us who are Orthodox conservatives have to have a sense of humility about the fact that the House of Reagan, as it was built, and we all thought it was sturdy and durable, for 30 years, had grown stilted and vulnerable. So this big bad wolf shows up and blows it down pretty easily. All the other candidates, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz especially, they all ran sort of in these Reagan ruts in terms of policy, in terms of tropes, and Trump didn't at all. And I think the party does need freshening up. It does need to be more populist in a couple of ways that Trump points to. One, Republicans should be the party of workers, not just the party of entrepreneurs. This is something that people forget about Lincoln, that he made the Republicans the party of the aspiring working man. And that's exactly where the contemporary Republican Party should be. The Republicans have been too beholden, I believe, to the elite consensus on immigration, which is lazy and out of touch. And so Trump represents a necessary readjustment in that area. And also, he represents a sense of this country as not an idea, as we so often hear from some of us on the right, but as a community and as a home. So I think all that is to the good. I think there are excesses. If I had my druthers, Paul Ryan would be more populist, and Donald Trump would be more conservative, and there'd be a happy medium there. But I think in any discussion of Trump, the thing you have to address, and his defenders and supporters aren't being honest unless they frankly acknowledge it, it's not just that he's crude in his expression or there's a stylistic issue. There are serious character weaknesses with this man. Now, none of us are perfect. No character of a president of the United States has ever been perfect. But he is vindictive, he is thin-skinned, he is immature, and maybe these things just play out in tweets and play out in things that ultimately don't matter. But usually in the pressure of that office, such character flaws play out in ways that matter. And I think that is what is most concerning about Donald Trump, and it has been what I've found most worrisome all along.
Can I just add one little point? I object to the word populist. I do not think that I am more ill-bred than you or more poorly educated than you are. And so if I like Trump, I don't think that makes me a populist. But I will say one other thing about your confession of Republican failure. You have followed your rules. It's a question from No Country for Old Men, Anton Chigurh. Do you remember that? He said, if you have followed your rules and your rules have brought you to this, of what use was your rules?
Yeah, our rules brought us to a pretty good situation, honestly, in 2015. But if conservatism is simply about getting in touch and getting 51%, for Trump's case, 46% of the vote, and winning the Electoral College instead of losing, fine. If that's what conservatism has become, that's great. That is not the conservatism. I mean, people might want to think about actual substantive results of policy. But if you think protectionism is the way to go, if you think NATO is just a stupid relic from the past, if you think being nice to Putin is the right thing to do in foreign policy, then defend that.
I believe we may have turned the corner to the second part of our discussion. But
we got this guy over here.
Point of personal privilege, before anyone accuses me of geometry, I was an English major and horrible at math. And two, if you actually have read National Review and paid any attention to it, you know we have been arguing for years that the party needs to have more middle-class appeal, pay more attention to the bread and butter interest of American workers. So accusing us of geometry, whatever that is, and I got a C in, is just not accurate.
So, Jim, I've got a three-part.
You don't want to continue this?
No, not now. In a moment, I have a three-part question for you. Your book bears the tantalizing title, "Shattered Consensus," and in a way, it really summarizes the raison d'etre of this panel, this roundtable discussion. So I wonder if, briefly, you could do three things. One is describe what that consensus was. I guess it would be the situation that Bill adumbrated. And then also briefly identify those forces that led to the shattering or the dissolution of the consensus. And finally, say a word or two about what happens next.
Tall order.
And I want you to follow the advice of that priest that W.H. Auden talked about, who said when someone came to him for confession, the priest would say, be brief, be blunt, and be gone.
I'll do my best. So I wrote this article a few years ago called The Fourth Revolution. And it kind of outlined a point of view which suggested that the post-war consensus that has guided American politics since 1945 was coming apart. I wrote this in the midst of the Obama administration. I felt that the United States, given its position in the world and its economy, should be a conservative country. It should be thinking about maintaining the order that had been created. Instead, Barack Obama was talking about transforming the country in a somewhat apocalyptic language. Not sure he always acted that way, but that was a lot of the rhetoric that he used. I did not foresee Donald Trump coming along, but Donald Trump is somewhat supportive of the thesis that I laid out. My thought was that after 70 years, the ideals and assumptions which had animated the American system for 70 years were losing their force and support in the American public. It seemed to me clear that among Democrats and liberals, support for American foreign policy abroad had dwindled, and it appeared to me that this was happening on the right as well. So I thought the consensus was coming undone. I put this in the context of three previous revolutions that have happened in America. Obviously, the revolutionary and constitutional period was one, the Civil War era was another, the Great Depression, World War II was another. In between those eras, we had quite different systems of political economy, all under the same Constitution. The Jeffersonian system organized around slavery and cotton exports, a Republican system after the Civil War organized around tariffs, protection, and industry, and a New Deal internationalist system organized by the Democrats that has sustained us through the post-war system. All these systems, 60 or 70 years apart, all these systems undone by very large events that transpired over a period of 10 or 20 years, all of them contributing something different to the American enterprise. The Jeffersonian system, as I said, based on slavery, expansion. The post-Civil War system industrialized the country. The post-war system defended freedom around the world and built a kind of welfare or social insurance state. All these very important, but they all came undone. Is the American system, post-war system, coming undone? That's the question I raised in that article. So I suggested that it was. Now, the underlying structure of the post-war order remains intact. The American military is the strongest in the world. The American economy is the strongest in the world. The dollar is the reserve currency around the world. That trade deficit we talk about lubricates the international system by supplying the world with dollars. Interest rates are low, inflation is low, the stock market is at all-time high. Why would this system come apart when all these things are working so well? Well, you know, I think the undoing of the post-war consensus is largely a political phenomenon. If we look at some of the things that have happened in the past, World War I, everyone said that it would be crazy to start a war in 1914. There's no underlying economic reason for that war. They went to war, and it was crazy that they did. The Civil War did not develop it developed out of economic conflicts, but not of any underlying depression. Cotton prices were high. Same is true of the American Revolution. So these are political events. They're not explained by underlying factors. So I suggest there are two kinds of politics. In the intervening period, there's a kind of a normal politics. Normal politics is when the parties and factions fight over policy. In the 19th century, it was often over tariffs. Before 1850, they fought over slavery, but they weren't ready to go to war over it. In the 20th century, we fought over taxes, we fought over tariffs, we've fought over regulation of one kind or another. In normal politics tends to be incremental, and there are never permanent losers or winners. You can come back to the table, you can negotiate it, you can bring it back, take it back. Normal politics is the kind of politics that takes place between periods of crisis. In periods of crisis, we have what would be called crisis politics. I call it regime politics. And regime politics is a fight over the very character of the state itself. What's the state going to look like? What is the state going to do? And what's going to be the controlling party or faction that controls this new state? In crisis politics or regime politics, there are permanent winners and permanent losers. The losers go home, and the winners go on to organize the subsequent system. As a consequence of that, regime politics tends toward violence and crisis, disruption, and upheaval. And we've seen that somewhat in the past. You can see a dynamic that takes place. If you look at the American Revolution and the Civil War, they start with arguments over policy, and those arguments over policy escalates into arguments over the regime. What kind of state are we going to have? Typically, there is an event. In the Revolution, it was the Boston Massacre, and before the Civil War is John Brown's raid, that sends the debate over policy into a debate over the nature of the regime. So I think the question I raised is, are we headed into a period now of what we would call crisis or regime politics, in which we will see upheaval, disorder, perhaps violence, and the creation of a new kind of state in the United States that comes out of this? Now, I don't really know the answer to that. I can't really see my way through that, but we have divided ourselves into two nations: red state nation and blue state nation, left nation and right nation, organized by party, by culture, by race and ethnicity to some degree. These two nations don't like one another. At least the elites don't like one another. When you go look at what's happening in Washington, you can see that. You can see a dynamic of polarization that is set in the arguments between the two parties in Washington. So I think the question I would raise is, where is this going? And what, in fact, are we fighting about? Why are 30,000 people showing up for a Donald Trump rally at midnight outside of Detroit before the election and other places as well? Why are millions of people taking to the streets to protest Donald Trump's policies? Why are thousands of people going out to harass congressmen? What is going on in America that's generating all this mobilization, upset, and anger? What exactly are we fighting about? So I don't really have an answer to that, but if we circulate back, maybe I can say a few words about what this fight is all about and where it's likely to go.
That was brilliant, but if we could just translate, I think what Jim was trying to say, there's going to be so much winning, you're going to get sick of it.
I hope that's true.
Would anyone like to comment on what anyone else has said? Peter?
Well, let me actually maybe build a little bit on what some other people have said, but stress like one aspect of this that's, I think, different, and it's not like the 1930s or 1860s or late 18th century, which is that the entire history of this country was a period of tremendous growth. And even though there were points when, there were certainly points when we had enormous conflict, there are certain kinds of ways you can resolve things in a generally growing society that are more challenging when the growth slows. So I made this point before, but if you're in a representative democracy, you have people seated around a table, and there's more for. You find a way to craft a compromise, and there's more for me and more for you and more for you. And if the person with the hat's the difficult person and nobody gets along with him, then he gets cut out of the deal. And as long as the pie's growing, that sort of kind of compromise is possible. And it's a question whether this our whole system actually works at all when there isn't that much growth. And that's why I sort of wonder whether the way these questions get framed is sort of very political or ideological or is always misleading. And I don't want to be sort of a Marxist or libertarian determinist, but I always do wonder whether these sort of questions of technological progress, increasing productivity, increasing growth are actually important. They've certainly been, always been part of our society, always been part of the American system, And they've been hitting a bit of a wall, I would argue, since the 1970s. It's not, not a complete wall. We still have progress in computers, internet, world of bits. But it's measured in all these data. There's been stagnation in wages, reduced expectations for the younger generation. And I think, and in that sense, I don't think the Trump phenomenon is unique. And if it would not have been Trump, it would have been somebody else. And in other Western countries, we're seeing some similar strains, and that's why I think it's always important for us to find a way back to the future, because if we don't have a society that's growing and progressing, it's not clear our system works at all. I mean, you can have a feudal society. You can have there are all sorts of ways you can organize societies that are stagnant. Most societies in most of human history were stagnant, but they were not representative, they were not constitutional republics.
Let me just take a stab at answering Jim. My teacher was Raymond Klebansky, and his teacher was Friedrich Tönnies, and his mentor was Friedrich Engels. So that only 3 generations separates you from the Communist Manifesto. Now, Marx had a problem with America. It didn't fit into the scheme. It was, in 1852, the most capitalist society around, and therefore should be poised for socialism, but it wasn't going to happen, he saw in America. His explanation was fluidity. His explanation was the classes were mobile, and therefore there was no possibility of class consciousness. But things have changed, and now we have a separation of classes, right? And that means that a specter has been haunting American politics, the specter of class struggle. And that Trump, I think, is the answer to that. At least the answer must come from someone who breaks up established elites and provides for a society in which not just the top 1 or 10%, but all Americans can flourish. It's not, I would say, about growth, but it's more importantly also about how that growth is going to be divided amongst us. Now, growth is extremely important, and we will be overtaken quickly by other countries to an embarrassing degree if we don't grow. But let's not forget that what 2012 and 2016 were about was class struggle.
Bill, do you want to respond to any of this?
Yeah, I very much like Jim's book, and I think we published aspects of it and follow-ons in the Weekly Standard, and Rich probably did a National Review too. The question that Jim leaves genuinely hanging, I think, as you say, it's unanswered right now, is we don't seem to have a crisis like the 3 crises that precipitated the regime changes, if you want to call it that, in 1776 to 89, and then 1861, and then 1930s. And so maybe we will have one. It's not, I think you thought at one point that debt might be the trigger of it. It's not an unreasonable thought, and it might still be. What's weird in a way about the moment is we have avoided the crises. 07, 08 was the obvious time for this to, the failure of Iraq, the perceived failure of Iraq, and then the failure when Obama got out finally, but combined with the crash of 07, 08, could have been the moment for a real, so to speak, big change. We didn't have it. Trump in some ways is a delayed reaction to that, and very much a reaction to Obama, I think. Progressivism led to, in my view, a sort of demagogic populism. That's an unfortunate reaction. It could have led, I think, to a much healthier conservatism and a restoration of limited government and constitutional respect for the Constitution and American leadership in the world, and it may still. But who knows? We're really in uncharted waters, and this is, Rich's point about Trump personally too. We shouldn't ignore that. We just have not had this experiment before. We have never had a president who had neither served in elective office, nor served in the cabinet, nor been a general officer in the U.S. military. Nothing wrong with not being one of those 3 things. Maybe it'll be good, but we just haven't had that before. We haven't had an administration that looks like this one in the White House, certainly in terms of lack of previous experience. Again, maybe that's a good thing if all the experience has been in failed policies and so forth. But it's why it's so hard to predict, I think, honestly, we're only 30 days in, how the Trump administration works out. And I think there's a huge range of outcomes that are possible. None of this is deterministic. But I'm skeptical that the outcome will be a happy one, because I'm just skeptical. Because if things are not deterministic, and if there's a huge range of outcomes, a lot usually depends on the leader, the guy at the top. And I don't have much confidence in this guy at the top.
Rich, do you want to? jump in?
Yeah, I agree. There are a broad range of possible outcomes here. There's a chance of a complete debacle, and there's a chance of 8 years of Trump and a fairly popular president. And you know, we're all focused on the tweets and the controversies of the last 6 hours, but ultimately what will determine his success or failure are events and crises, which are always unforeseen and unpredictable, and how he reacts to them and how he handles them, and results, especially on the economy. And I think what he's pointing towards is obviously a different kind of Republican economics where there's less focus purely on growth. That's part of the picture, but there's a much more focus on wages. And it seems to me his basic theory is you get the economy growing to the extent you can, deregulation and sort of these traditional Republican growth-oriented measures, and then you really try to create a tighter labor market further down the income scale by discouraging offshoring in all sorts of ways, including moral suasion or bullying, however you want to put it, and by cracking down on immigration and the importation of foreign labor to compete with American workers. And if the economy grows, and if the labor market gets tighter and wages go up, Donald Trump probably could take emoluments in the middle of Fifth Avenue, and it wouldn't matter. If those things don't happen, and if he doesn't deliver on the economy, all these kind of criticisms that sort of seem ticky-tacky will add up. And I think the case that will cut against him is that he's self-interested. He is in it for his business and enriching his sons and these billionaire members of his cabinet. And he wasn't a real, sorry, frankly, I'll use the word again because I don't consider it pejorative, he wasn't a real populist. That's the case that could cut against him, but it depends ultimately on the results.
Jim?
Well, I would agree that there are a number of things that Donald Trump can do in the realm of normal politics to improve the economy, to reform Obamacare, to deal with financial regulation and Dodd-Frank, to promote economic growth, and that would be very important. But I do think Donald Trump has a vision of the state that I think is important and is one of the things that's driving the division that's taking place in the United States. I believe Donald Trump is not capable of articulating that vision, but there is something that he's doing that is creating tremendous blowback, and it's also creating tremendous enthusiasm. One of the problems with normal politics in a situation like this is that all sorts of cultural conflict gets displaced upon normal issues, whether it's taxes or banking regulation. The parties begin to see these as stand-ins for cultural conflicts, and as a consequence of that, they're not negotiable. But the Donald Trump vision seems to be to restore the United States to a traditional nation state. That doesn't sound like a revolutionary idea, but the United States is a nation state dedicated to universal ideas, equality and freedom. Those two things have always been in tension. In the post-war order, in the post-war world, the United States has taken responsibility to spreading these ideas around the world. Donald Trump seems to take the idea that we need to restore an idea of the United States as a normal nation state with borders and boundaries. We control who comes in. And when we go out, when we pursue foreign policy, we do so in something called the national interest or the American interest, not in terms of worldwide goals. So he said, I think at one point in the campaign, I want to be the president of the United States, not the president of the world. And I think that's somewhat what he was driving at. Now, the one question that I have and can't get my arms around is why is this such a controversial point of view that he's driving at? What is it that's driving the opposition crazy when Donald Trump tries to restore the United States to a traditional form of nation state? I don't really have, I can't really explain that, but there is a view out there. I saw in one of the demonstrations a sign that someone had on the immigration business. The sign said, "All are welcome." And I think the idea was that somehow the United States, people all over the world have a right, have kind of American rights under the Constitution. Now, of course, that's totally unworkable. That can never happen. But I think that in left America, there is this idea of America as a universal nation. In Donald Trump's America, there is this idea that the United States is a traditional nation state defending the people in this country. And that is somewhat of the background of this very divisive conflict that's going on in the United States today.
Well, it's
I believe
so
Jim's-
divisive because it's a culture issue. And it's a question of who we are and not just how much we're going to spend or how much regulation we're going to have. And what's happened is Trump's kind of reoriented the culture war away from the traditional emphasis on religious-oriented issues and sexual immorality to these issues of sovereignty and the legitimacy of the nation state.
But I think this is both over-intellectualizing and overly generous. I mean, of course, every defense of Trump ends up being 3/4 of a criticism of a stupid left-wing progressivism and overly universal cosmopolitanism that I'm certainly against and have criticized for years, and that every other Republican candidate is against and would criticize for years. But what does this mean? All this, I mean, for me, Trump is a demagogue in the way that Joe McCarthy was a demagogue, and Huey Long was a demagogue, and George Wallace was a demagogue, and this one happened to become president, which is on the whole an unfortunate thing. The good news, perhaps, is that he decided not to run as a third-party candidate, but to take over the Republican Party. I think it's unfortunate that he did so, and we'll see if he really did so, but he certainly won the presidency. But that does constrain him in certain ways and maybe channels him into a better agenda. But at the end of what is he doing to restore the nation state? And what is he doing to restore the nation state that Rubio or Walker, it's all this nice talk. He believes in a kind of vision of America and he's going to help all those working class wages. The only practical thing anyone has mentioned is the restricting lower wage immigration, which I think is going to have a very limited effect on people in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and Canton, Ohio, who have not lost their jobs to immigrants. There aren't that many immigrants there. They have lost their job to globalization and technology. And if Trump wants to deglobalize the American economy, that will lower workers' standards of living. And if he wants to slow the rate of growth of technology, partly by making us less welcoming to immigrants and to foreign capital and labor, then that's also going to be bad for these people. So saying that he has a vision of the nation and the nation state and a vision of a kind of working class, what does that amount to? It is literally like saying that Huey Long had a vision that was different from Franklin Roosevelt and the Republicans at the time, very pedestrian, old-fashioned vision of changing things in a more incremental way.
I think it's precisely the lack of vision that is the important thing that's what's going on. So the clearest vision maybe was FDR and the New Deal, and you had a very small government staffed with very competent people, and it naturally would get to be much bigger. And you sort of had this shift from laissez-faire capitalism to managerial capitalism, and there's no natural way to simply reverse the New Deal. These structures are very robust, and you can't sort of just unravel them. But I sort of wonder whether it is sort of the anti-New Deal, where we're starting with a state that's very big and full of really incompetent people. And the thing that's shocking about DC is how bad the people in our government are. And they're not aware of it.
And how many there are.
They're not aware of it. It's when you go to Washington, people actually think it's a well-functioning city, that everything works, everything's great. You don't have these sorts of conceits in London or Paris. I mean, they at least are aware of all the problems that they have, and I think we are sort of at this anti-New Deal moment, and if it's an anti-New Deal moment, it doesn't look like this incredibly big vision. It's instead going to slowly come apart. And I'm not sure what I'm not sure what the right analogy would be. It would be like when Constantine took over the the Roman Empire, and you stopped subsidizing the old pagan gods, and there were all these people who'd been paying lip service to the pagan gods for a long time, and when they stop getting subsidized, we'll see how much they really believe in them after a while.
Jim?
Well, I don't think Donald Trump is any more of a demagogue than Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders were. His demagoguery consists of appealing to a different population. That population is out in the hinterlands in America. They're not visible always to Washington. They're not visible to people in New York and Washington. And as a consequence, when someone appeals to them, they're labeled demagogues, which I regard as totally unfair.
I agree that all four of them are demagogues. Why is that hard to understand?
Well, if that's the case, then demagoguery is an integral part of democratic politics.
No, it's a
And
decline.
probably
No,
maybe
it's
it
a
is.
decline. It's a decline from a somewhat better
So why
politics.
are you calling Trump a demagogue? You didn't call Obama a demagogue. Or
I
Hillary
did call.
Clinton a
I believe
demagogue.
that we did all call Obama a
I don't
demagogue many
recall
times.
that.
When
I
he
never
said,
heard
"Nation,
that.
we can't stay in Iraq because nation building has to begin at home," I thought that was the worst form of demagoguery, appealing to people, falsely promising that somehow getting out of Iraq would help here. Trump is a particularly. The others are more substantive. They have actually mistaken policy views, I would say, whereas Trump is a pure demagogue in the sense that he doesn't actually have many views, so he simply saw what the anxieties and grievances were out there, as you keep saying, and this America that the rest of us allegedly have no connection to and has somehow just mysteriously, suddenly mysteriously appeared to vote for Trump, though actually the vote wasn't that different, of course, for the vote for Romney or the vote for, in 2014, for Tom Cotton and Ben Sasse and Joni Ernst and all those people. Are the House and Senate Republicans who ran ahead of Donald Trump? Are the House and Senate Republicans who ran ahead of Donald Trump? They were able to get those same votes.
They got the same
They got
vote
the
as
same
Romney
votes
got.
without the
Is
demagoguery.
Romney a demagogue?
No, he is not. Because
Well, he
Romney
got the same vote, so why is Trump a demagogue?
Because Trump appeals to those voters in demagogic ways in a way that Romney didn't. Unfortunately, maybe that's why Romney lost. But Joni Ernst and Tom Cotton and Ben Sasse got the same votes. More Republicans in the House and Senate ran ahead of Trump than behind Trump, and they did so without being as demagogic and as damaging to the civil structure and to public discourse as Trump.
A demagogue is someone who wins on the basis of issues you don't like.
Okay. Is that really the view of conservatives today, that there's no principled distinction between a normal Democratic politician, who of course makes compromises and isn't a saint and all that, and a demagogue? We have obliterated the distinction between normal politics and demagoguery. Is that the current conservative view of things?
Stay tuned. Next week, same time, same channel. Now, we really are pretty much at the end of our time, but I will take just a couple of questions. If let's see, yes.
Howard Husick, Manhattan Institute. I would love to know from Frank and from Peter Thiel what your sense is, since there seems to be some division of the House here, and there's a quaint term called loyal opposition. What would loyal opposition look like in the Trump administration?
Loyal in the sense of Democrats or Republicans? I'm not sure if I follow.
Well, I think we're talking intra-party opposition, because that's what we're seeing here.
There's nothing disloyal about opposing Trump, whatever your party might happen to be. The distinction is not between loyalty and disloyalty. The distinction in my mind is between an intelligent realization of where we are and a foolish assumption of American greatness which doesn't exist but which needs to be restored.
Yeah, I would say that it's some well, it's, I don't know, it's sort of like you know it when you see it, I guess, and I'm not going to try to precisely define it. I would say that there probably was a mistake the Republicans made with Obama, where it was too reflexively anti-Obama. Everything he did was terrible. He was just this communist, and so on. And
That's true.
And that was it was somehow, it may have been true. I believed all of this too, but somehow that was a way
That's the lineage going back to Ingalls.
not acknowledging some of the things that had gone wrong. And I think there's the most effective opposition will be one that somehow acknowledges the reality of where things are today.
Roger?
My question is, although it's really early, as Bill said, or somebody said, we're only 30 days in this. It's early days yet. But to the best of your knowledge, your best judgment, is sort of the conservative coalition, can that be put back together again? Is this Humpty Dumpty going to be able to come back together? Now you might postulate, well, it depends upon what Trump is doing or what he isn't doing. It's a fair statement. But there's been such an incredible divisiveness. This is a vitriol that we haven't seen in certainly conservative politics probably since the early National Review days, when Buckley began to really change what was then the National Review crowd, and it never quite was at this level. It hadn't happened since the Reagan years. What's this is this, in your best judgment, is everyone going to be happy together again and, this is kumbaya time?
Well, you said it yourself. We're 1 month into it, and I suggest we wait for a couple of years. And I can well imagine how Bill Kristol is loved, because he is amiable. He truthfully is. But when he makes predictions, I pay particular attention, because they are always so jaw-droppingly, completely 180% off. So your predictions as to where we'll be in a couple of years.
So Frank,
I don't.
are you always so gracious, or is it just when you're in the Harvard Club?
Here's the thing: in a couple of years, we'll have a better sense of where we are. Now, one possibility is that we will, for example, have advanced in the rankings of economic liberty from our current mediocre number 17 to, let us say, within the top 10. And at that point, the libertarians amongst us will start to ask themselves, in our opposition to Donald Trump, was I simply playing with myself? Or it may be that Bill is right. And at that point, I'll confess that I was wrong.
Bill, your name has been invoked.
I'm not in favor of confessions of one kind or another, certainly not forced ones or involuntary ones. I don't know. I mean, I think it's the right question, and I think we are in uncharted waters, not just about the Trump White House and presidency, but a little bit about our politics as a whole. And I could imagine, in effect, a defaulting back to fairly familiar coalitions. It's not as if you went to Congress today and talked to the 52 Republican senators and the 48 Democratic senators. You would think, whoa, this is totally different from 2015 or even 2005 or even 1995, So, and they were all elected, just like Trump. So one could be overinterpreting the moment. And I think that's quite likely. But I think it's also possible that even though this moment wasn't inevitable, once it's happened, and happens for 4 years, it has real consequences. World War I wasn't inevitable. It was the result of a lot of contingent events. But once it happened, it changed the world. And in that respect, one could imagine a reorientation of American politics. Yes, I think that's possible. You could have a nationalist, anti-immigration, to oversimplify, America First party. And you could imagine having that could be very different from let's say, a Buckley-Reagan conservatism. And maybe that Buckley-Reagan conservatism you can imagine the left splitting too, incidentally. I mean, the biggest fact about this election, I think, one of the biggest facts, actually, was 45% of the Republicans voted for Trump, Republican primary voters voted for Trump, 45% of Democratic primary voters voted for Sanders. Both, outside the mainstream of recent, I'm not saying this normatively, I'm just analytically, outside the mainstream of recent candidates in either party. That does show an awful lot of popular discontent with both Clinton liberalism and, Rubio, Walker, Bush, et cetera, republicanism and conservatism. And how that plays out, I think, is very hard to tell.
Yeah, the optimistic case is that you have sort of a coming together of the Reagan wing and now what's, a very powerful populist wing that a lot of people wouldn't have thought would exist 2 years ago. And the optimistic case, you look at the Gorsuch nomination. Does Donald Trump care deeply about constitutional jurists who are skeptical of executive power? I doubt it. He did that as an act of transactional politics with the traditional conservatives who helped put him over the top in November. And I think we'll know a lot more in a year. Does the congressional agenda pass? Does Trump help it pass? Does he actually pay attention to what's going on in Congress? Because actually this agenda is now floundering at the moment, in part because Congress is inherently fractious and chaotic, and it needs presidential leadership. It needs the president to say, this is what replacement should look like. This is the answer on whether we're going to have a border adjustment tax or not, and whether the House Republicans or the Senate Republicans are going to win that debate. But if a year from now nothing's passed and relations with Congress have deteriorated, well then the answer may be that there's not going to be a coming together and there's going to be a big split. And one possible outcome here is, you have 3 chiefs of staff at the moment. You have Reince Priebus, you have Steve Bannon, and you have Jared Kushner. That is inherently an unstable situation. The one guy who can't be fired and will never be fired is Jared Kushner. And what you may see if relations with Congress go badly, if the first year or two go badly, you really could see Jared and Ivanka taking over, and a non-ideological administration that's a little bit, I don't think Trump will ever do the full Schwarzenegger, which is basically switching to the other side when he realized being on our side was too hard, but you could see a mini version of that.
Let me actually try to take one crack at that question, maybe frame it as, I came of age politically in the 1980s when I was in high school, college, and the robust part of the Reagan coalition, the social conservatism, the free market, capitalism, the hawkish defense policy. And you sort of ask, what did the minister and the general and the Ayn Rand devotee, what did those 3 people have in common? They were all really anti-communist. And I think the reality is that that conservatism has, it's been somewhat, it has had less of that glue ever since 1989. Now, I don't actually know that the specter of communism is any less serious today than it was, in the 1980s. And so perhaps perhaps the question is, why are we less afraid of communism today? Is the way I would. By many standards, Sanders was, maybe the most radical candidate since, Henry Wallace or somebody like that. And Obama was close to a communist. Yes. You couldn't really say that; it didn't work politically, and certainly we, there is this incredible move to the left that's happening, in many parts of the world that we're scarcely commenting on. I recently had lunch with a friend of mine from college who was in El Salvador, and I hadn't tracked El Salvador in politics, but basically the FMLN guerrillas, the communist guerrillas won the election in El Salvador in 2009. They got reelected in 2014, even more left-wing, and at this point it's indistinguishable from Nicaragua. And it's not something we're alarmed about.
We are basically out of time. Jim, did you want to make one final point?
Just very quickly, I think Peter may be right in suggesting that modern conservatism is somewhat of an artifact of the Cold War, started in the Cold War, grew in the Cold War. The left-right battle is something of an artifact of the post-war period. But I would agree. I believe that the Democrats are going to move left. They're headed toward Bernie Sanders country. One thing I would watch is if there's another vacancy on the Supreme Court. If we say Ginsburg leaves this summer and Trump gets to appoint another Supreme Court justice, I believe that would be a battle royal for that seat, because it's occurred to people that if you can get 5 members of the Supreme Court of your party, you may have the power to change the regime, as I talk about it, to make fundamental changes in the nature of the system. And I believe the left will do anything they can do to keep that from happening.
I want to thank the 5 members of this panel. I think they were very successful at batting around a question in a way that was illuminating, but never answering it. So thank you all for coming.